us about what we're going to discuss.
The male has no season in which he is not willing to engage in the breeding act.
Could you have been sleeping in a position that stimulated you? Grinds her clothed genitals on his leg while he's fully clothed. He becomes aroused, but doesn't ejaculate.
Be honest with yourself and Jehovah about your weaknesses.
Hello everybody, Dr. Jason W. Morrison. Thank you for joining me as we speak on the subject, oh no, what now? I am a Jehovah's Witness, marriage and sex. Let's go. In the last talk, we got onto the subject of Galatians chapter 7. And this is Paul writing, and we had some pretty strong things to say about it. Anyway, he says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife. Now, this is really bizarre. This is a really bizarre statement. Paul's saying let sex be the motivation for marriage. Have you ever seen that before? Paul's saying let sex be the motivation for marriage, and I don't really agree with that. I don't agree with that. Sex isn't a strong enough motivation to have a woman. If you only want to have a woman because of sexual immorality, then your motivation's wrong from the start. And that's why many young people's marriages collapse. Now, he says down here, just let me jump forward a bit, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time. So you might say to your missus, I don't want to have sex for the next month because I'm going to be fasting and praying. And she has to say yes. And that's fair enough too, because people have needs, usually affectionate ones. But as I said before, not all people have the same affection levels as others. Not all people have the same sex drives as others. And this is where compatibility came in, and this is when God made Adam and then gave Adam Eve. It was because he needed someone comparable to him. If she hadn't have been incomparable or compatible, it would have been a waste of time. So compatibility is a great thing. Now, obviously religion, Paul's allowing religious matters to put personal needs on hold. Now you might agree with that or not agree with that. I have a little bit of difficulty with that, because if it suits one and not the other, which he goes later down into here, it can become very, very complicated and resentment can set in. And you're actually, to be honest with you, you are allowing Satan to begin to start causing trouble and tension and resentments and things. I can't find where religion should be an excuse for a husband or a wife to begin neglecting the things that he's committed themselves to within a marriage. Of course, unless they've agreed to it. Now, it reminds me of this elder, J.W. Elder, that I used to speak to in the park. It didn't last for very long, and I'll tell you why. He was one of these guys that was fully and totally committed to the organisation. He'd tell you whatever you wanted to hear to try and get you in, and I was aware of this. And despite my theological understanding of the Bible, I could just see that this guy was completely deceived, was happy to be deceived, didn't want to change his mind for anybody. Well, what happened in the end? This guy's decided to bring his wife down. Now, I tell you, this woman was hard. She made this guy look like a choir boy. Very attractive woman, very well presented, but her heart was about as hard as you're ever going to get. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we got on to the discussion of sexual immorality, because I wasn't married at the time, and they were trying to use that as a vice to get me into the Jehovah Witness movement. But I was a bit of a wake-up to that, because this is down on the waterfront, and they call me the solo man, because I'll do my cycling training, and then I'll paddle the sup from the sailing club to the stadium and back, and then I'll do laps at the pool. So I got this name of being the solo man. Now, I could see this woman was starting to probe my activities with women, but I was actually in a relationship at the time, and I can go into that a little bit further later. but sticking with what I'm talking about here, what happened was she was saying how devoted wives are and all the rest of it, and I said that's not always the case. She goes, how do you know? I said, well, I've had married women approach me. She goes, where? I said, well, I used to be one of the head bouncers at the Central Coast Leagues Club on the Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia. And what that was because I had a good rapport with people, they put me between the front door and the sign-in desk. Now, the people at the front door did the main part of turning people away if they were intoxicated or not. But when you're at the main desk, you were the last port of call to make sure people were in order before they entered. Of course, dressed in a suit and tie and all the rest of it. You'd have 1,000, 1,200 people come into that place to the nightclub of a night. So what used to happen was I'd have dozens of women offering me their phone numbers and asking me what I'd be doing when I was knocking off, and many of them were married, unhappily married. And this is what I was trying to get across to this lady, and some of them were Christian women as well. Well, I wasn't interested because I believe that if you're with somebody, you do the right thing by that person. But what I was trying to show this woman is just because you're in a religion doesn't mean that everything's hokey-dory. A lot of people are living with resentments that stretch far back to the point where people put the children in the bed, they put the dog in the bed to use as a shield, but they don't say this dog's a shield. They make it look like it, everybody's happy and this hell will do it. Or they even sleep in separate beds, but you don't see that outside closed doors. There's a lot of resentment and a lot of hurt within marriages today, and particularly within religion, although it looks all good on the surface. Now, what I'm getting at here is Paul's saying that if you are suffering from sexual passions, and this word down here, lack of self-control in verse 5, that can also say passions. That can be translated passions as passions. This is locked up. What's happened here? Yeah, it's passions. So I don't think passion towards somebody is a strong enough or legitimate enough reason to go rushing into a marriage. Now let me share another testimony with you. While serving as a minister in a church I pioneered, it got up to about 40. There was a gentleman that was in the church, a very nice man, gentleman, and then a woman come to the church. She had 4 children from 3 separate marriages before she became single again. Well, she got alongside this bloke, and to cut a long story short, within 3 months they decided that they wanted to get married, in which I said, I don't know if that's a good idea at this stage. Obviously the woman had plenty of sexual experience, if I can say that respectfully, but the man I knew had been, for the most part, on his own and a bit of a struggler when it come to women. And I could see where this was going to go. Well, to cut a long story short, they did get married, and the marriage lasted about 3 months. The compatibility that was there was nil, but the passion that was there was 100, as it were. But it wasn't enough to keep the marriage together. And this is where I struggle with Paul's motivation here. Why would you go rushing into a marriage, right? And this is where I believe religion falls down with these principles. Why would you go rushing into a marriage because of sexual immorality? Now you stop and think about that. Because you have sexual passions, a lack of self-control. Is that really fair on the person that you're getting married to? Or I suppose it'd be fair if this other person had the same trouble. I mean, if you're sex mad and that's the motivation behind your marriage, you're going to wear each other out anyway. You soon get tired of it. So for me, I have a bit of difficulty with this. I think to some extent, whilst it doesn't sound religious or right, there has to be some kind of sexual experimentation. I know that sounds wrong, But if the people are old enough and not sure, then surely they can try and cultivate between themselves some kind of identification as to where the relation should or could be headed in a sexual way. What happens is, unfortunately, and I've seen this getting back to the elder and his wife, they had a young man that was their disciple. They used to haul him down to the carts, a very nice young man to sit and talk with, very passionate and committed to the Jehovah Witnesses. And I spent a few hours with that guy. He was a lovely guy. But what came out as I got to know them more was he'd been previously married. And it only lasted a month, and she jumped the fence and left him. I don't think he ever recovered. You could see that his spirit was scarred. Now, I tried to find out what had happened, and I asked this guy, like, how are you trained sexually? Like, what went wrong? Because he said he didn't know what went wrong. Well, people don't go and get married for no reason, and then all of a sudden the bum fall out of it, as it were. Well, I don't think one or the other had a clue about how either one was going to feel or perform intimately. And I think it went upside down and it caused the marriage to fail. Can you see my point? And so what we ended up with is two very seriously scarred and marred young people who didn't deliberately set out to hurt each other at all, but because of possibly ignorance or not being trained in the things of intimacy and how it works beforehand and what happens afterhand, ended up with a dissolved marriage and two very possibly broken-hearted people, wounded people. Now Paul goes on to say, and let each woman have her own husband. Yeah, well, jumping the fence isn't going to help anybody, but that's another subject, isn't it? On the one hand, you have women that really, in some cases, some women have a higher sex drive than men. And if they get married to a man that isn't going to live up to her expectations, at some stage or another, the possibility of her jumping the fence to meet her gratifications is going to be a higher possibility. So compatibility is a big thing here. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due to her. Now, what if a husband can't do that? What if he's not at the same affectionate level as her? And likewise also the wife to a husband. Well, what if the wife can't do that? What if she's not running at the same sexual cycle as what he is? Now, this is where it becomes complicated. Well, how are you supposed to know if you haven't had sex before you get married? You're saying it's allowed. I'm not saying it's allowed. I'm just asking the question. How are you supposed to know what the sexual cycle of a person is if you haven't experienced it with that person? You're just not going to know. It doesn't come down to maturity and all the rest of it. What it does come down to is not getting married on a sexual motivation. It comes down to getting married because you care. That's what's supposed to be the motivation. And let's carry on. The wife does not have authority over her own body. Now, you just think about it for a minute. All of a sudden, this person is given the authority of a body to another person, to a man. Yeah, she's probably attracted to that man and likes that man, but what if the intimacy side of it's not what she expected? And all of a sudden, it's just coming at her all the time, or irregularly, or however it works, but she's not comfortable with it because she didn't know beforehand what was going to be the experience. On the other hand, it could be good, but what if it's not? And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body. Now, I have had, and do excuse me, this was before I was a Christian, women that have had a higher sex drive than mine. And I've had to learn how to manage that. But how would I have known that that was even a possibility unless I'd learnt or been trained in that? Some people just do not know what they're getting themselves into. And do not deprive one another except with consent for a time. Now, this is a really strange thing to say. This is a real religious statement. Do not deprive one another except for consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. Well, yes, there are times when fasting and prayer is necessary. But what if one doesn't agree? What if there's never an agreement on this factor? then there's going to be tension, isn't it? How does sex then affect fasting and prayer? Because fasting and prayer is probably at the end of the day a private thing, isn't it? But is it private to the point it comes to the exclusion of your partner? Well, that's something you have to make your mind up about yourself. I just can't see, for the most part, if there's not an agreement on this, how fasting and prayer comes to the exclusion of affection towards a partner. Now, what have I done here? There we go. And then come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now listen for a minute. What he's saying is you can go fasting and praying to the point where the other person's losing control and their passions are running away with them, but they're going to blame Satan for it. This is a big problem in Christianity and religious organisations today, and Jehovah Witnesses and all this. They're blaming Satan for things that are dysfunctional within themselves, that need not have been there. And this is where shunning comes in and all the other stuff. Because when dysfunction's overtaking what appears to be good religious activities, then somebody has to get the blame. And if it's not Satan, I guarantee you it's going to be the husband or the wife. And this is where backbiting and bickering and all this other stuff starts to take place. But it's taking place in the name of religious devotion. So the religious devotion will win out over the patience and tolerance of the other person, even though there's consent. Because I've seen it 1,000 times. They're getting the consent to perform their religious devotions, but the consent is undermined or underpinned with resentment, and ultimately that resentment causes the person with the resentment to jump the fence, while this person's thinking that they're getting brownie points with God and with this person because they're religiously devoted. Does that make sense? Religious devotion is not an excuse for the exclusion of marital affection. And passion is not an excuse for marriage. And it has nothing at all to do with Satan. It has to do with human dysfunction. As a matter of fact, I'd say it would be Satan that would be tempting people to get married because they're burning with passion. Because there's nothing sensible about that, is there? That's not a sensible motivation for marriage. Because if you get married because of passion, what if that person suffers an accident and you cannot perform passionately with that person anymore, and you've got to care for them for the rest of your life? Passion is not a strong enough motivation to go and get married to somebody. Can you see what I'm saying? So I don't understand where Paul's come up with this. And nevertheless, but I say this as a concession. Oh yeah, great concession, and not as a commandment. So at least he is admitting that it's his idea. And I don't know where commandments come into it, because there's only one commandment. Do you know what that is? And Jesus gave it himself. Do you know what that commandment is? That you shall love your neighbour as yourself, which is a very big impact on all of this, because if you're dysfunctional within yourself, then you're going to be dysfunctional at some stage or other to the detriment of your marriage and your friendships. That's why Jesus said, love your neighbour as yourself. Can you see that? You've got to get yourself in order and functioning and right before you can be in order and functioning and right with somebody else. For I wish that all men were even as I myself. Now, that's contradictory as well, to a point. Now, Paul's saying that, again, on a religious, devotional plane to the exclusion of human affection. I don't know if you've ever heard it explained that way before, but that's what it is. And not everybody wants to be a eunuch. I'll never be a eunuch. I don't want to be. I like the company of my beautiful partner, my beautiful wife-to-be, and I can't see how religion can cause you to be on your own. I just can't see how that happens, but I know it does all over the world. But each one has his own gift from God, and one in this manner and one in that manner. And this is where I talk about compatibility again. If two people get together and it's all running on passion, but then after the honeymoon phase, they're just not compatible, one's in this manner and one's in the other, then you'll have one going north and one going south, and it'll just end in all sorts of sadness and harm and conflict. On that note, this is Dr. J.W. Morrison closing. Thank you for listening, and bye for now. Yeah, Dr. Jason Morrison, theologist again. I just want to say thank you for watching the videos, and I hope you got plenty of self-rediscovery and freedom out of it. If you watched it on YouTube, please share or like, maybe even comment. If you watched it on Facebook, like, comment, share. But most of all, get out and live. This isn't a rehearsal. You've got a one-off life. Don't let your loyalty and your faithfulness blind you to the life that you should be experiencing. Till the next video, thank you for watching, and bye for now.